Thank you so much for joining us today and in our past seminars. We really appreciate the thoughtful questions everyone has sent in. We got a ton of them, so we're going to answer as many of them today as we can. And we also have with us one of our staff attorneys who's going to provide some updates on Minnie's and Happy's cases before he has to jump off and get back to work. So we just wanted to start with some quick introductions because some of you might not know who we all are. My name is Lauren Choplin. I'm the NhRP's Communications Director. Probably emailed with a lot of you over the last 7 years. You probably have never seen me. So hi, it's nice to meet you in this way. So I live in Portland, Oregon with my canine companion Schneider, who's just off camera licking his leg. So he may make an appearance. If he barks, I'll probably mute myself and help calm him down. But so I have been with the NhRP, as I said, for about 7 years. I started as a volunteer in grad school where I was, my research focus was in part on how non-human animals are represented in literature. And then in one of my courses, it was a course on modernist literature and animal studies. I learned of the NhRP in a theoretical text, and it was at a time when we hadn't yet filed suit. But I was intrigued by the NhRP's approach as outlined in that book. So long story short, I followed the organization on social media. I answered a call for volunteers. And then at a certain point when the then social media manager left to go to law school, they asked me to become social media manager because of my writing background. And then from there, I just did as much. I was so eager to get involved, which I'm sure you guys can understand, that I did as much work as I could alongside my grad school studies. And then over time, I actually decided to leave my program because I was so invested in the work I was doing with NhRP. And eventually I became communications director. And for those of you who aren't quite sure what that involves, I mean, it's a lot of writing, editing, blog posts, press releases, things like that. And then broadly speaking, my job involves like thinking through how best to communicate the work we're doing and what's going on in our cases and everything else to various audiences. So our supporters, the media, the skeptics out there, all of that stuff. So yeah, and I'm on my computer all day, every day. So yeah, so that's fun. That's probably true for a lot of us, but anyway, so that's me. I wanna now pass the mic, so to speak, to Courtney, and then go from there.
Hi, hopefully the sound is on. I'm Courtney. I'm NhRP's, or Courtney Fern. I'm the Non-Human Rights Project's Director of Government Relations and Campaigns. And I'll just do a quick overview since I did a longer one during my webinar, which is on YouTube, along with all the other ones that we've done so far. I've been with the organization for a little over 2 years, and I have a background in environmental law and policy. And prior to joining the NhRP, I worked in animal advocacy for about 3 years. And at the NhRP, I oversee our legislative and grassroots advocacy, as well as manage our campaigns. And I have my canine companion, Silencio, who's off camera, and I can almost guarantee he's going to make an appearance because he likes to get the attention. So I'll pass it over to Kevin.
Hey, my name is Kevin Schneider. I just had to decline a phone call from our founder, Steve Wise. Clearly, he forgot about our Zoom session today. He did our first Zoom session, which you can also find on YouTube, and I did one last week. I don't know, time is kind of funny right now. So I'm in Brooklyn at home where I live. Also here happily with a canine companion named Trip, who's sleeping on the floor. And no, now he's looking at me kind of funny, like, what are you doing? Let's go outside. But I'm a lawyer. I've been with the organization all told for about 10 years. I started as a volunteer before law school and was really inspired to go to law school in large part by the Non-Human Rights Project and the work that Steve has been doing, Steve Wise, our founder, has been doing for decades, really. So for the last 5 years, I've been in the position of executive director after many years of doing legal volunteer work and other things and being involved with the organization. So I'm happy to be here and happy to see so many great questions come in, and we're just really glad to be able to have done this on a weekly basis. It's gone really well, so we're looking forward to continuing it into May and potentially beyond as well. And now I'm excited because I always learn something when Spencer speaks. So I'll pass to Spencer, who I know has updates on our ongoing legal cases, which I'm sure everyone is curious to hear about.
Hi, my name is Spencer Lowe. I'm a staff attorney with the NhRP, and I'm currently zooming in from Brooklyn, New York. I've been a staff attorney since December of 2018, shortly after we filed our habeas corpus petition in Happy's case. Before that, I volunteered with the organization for a number of years since graduating from law school. As a staff attorney, my work centers heavily around legal research and writing. I spend quite a bit of time on legal databases, looking up case law, trying to hone our legal arguments and updating them when necessary. I would say that a big part of my job is to understand how changes in the law can potentially impact our cases, both positively and negatively, and come up with legal strategies in response to those changes.
Thank you so much, Spencer. And before you hop off, do you want to give us some updates on Minnie and Happy's cases?
Oh, sure. So in Happy's case, Justice Allison Tuitt, she's the justice on the Bronx Supreme Court who oversaw Happy's case. She issued her decision back in February of this year. About a week later, we filed what's called a notice of appeal, which is a formal notice that starts the process of appealing her decision. And we're appealing it to one of the intermediate appellate courts in New York, which is called the First Department Appellate Division. Right now, the legal team is working on drafting the legal brief that will be filed in the First Department, and we expect to finish that well before the end of the summer. In Minnie's case, her appeal before the Connecticut Appellate Court, which is her second appeal, has been fully submitted and argued, and so we're just waiting on the court to issue its decision. What's hopeful about her case is that due to a recent technical change in habeas corpus procedural law, a change made by the Connecticut Supreme Court, we expect the appellate court to actually reverse and remand the case back to the trial court. That would allow us to appeal any adverse decision for a third time to the appellate court, with the opportunity to finally and thoroughly address the court's prior decision, which was the first appellate decision that we received in Connecticut, which held that we didn't have standing to file a habeas corpus petition on Minnie's behalf. And so we're all looking forward to that.
Great, thank you so much. And if anyone has any follow-up questions on our cases, just know that we'll be having future webinars devoted exclusively to our litigation, and then we'll probably touch on some of the questions people might have anyway. You can always email us at info@nonhumanrights.org. But for now, we will let Spencer go because he has to get back into all that. So thank you, Spencer, and we'll see you later.
Okay. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay. So the way we're going to do this, we had a ton of questions, so I've organized them roughly according to topic. And so some questions are going to be grouped together and where there's overlap and things like that. And we don't always have names attached to the questions, but where we do have them, we'll give a shout out. The first set of questions has to do with our approach, why our strategy is what it is in relation to our legislation and our litigation. So the first question, and I'm going to be using my cell phone, so that's what I'm doing, if you're wondering why I'm looking at that. But so our first question comes from Patty. She asks, is slowly starting with smaller situations and challenges with individual clients a better avenue to take right now to gain rights for animals? So just before I throw that question to Courtney and Kevin, I'll just say that broadly speaking, we see ourselves as addressing on multiple fronts the core issue that all animals and their advocates face, which is animals' rightlessness. So while we do take on, one client at a time with our litigation and then one city at a time with our legislation, we see ourselves as just being laser focused on that core systemic issue that cuts across so many different situations. So I'll start us off with that. But then, yeah, Kevin and Courtney, do you want to speak a little more specifically to why we work incrementally and take a long-term approach in our litigation and legislation? Maybe Kevin, you go first.
Sure. I would kind of offer a kind of example, I think, that really kind of demonstrates why we have to take what can, I think, look like a very too narrow of an approach sometimes when we're talking about the species that we talk about, great apes, elephants, whales. And we were in court on Happy's behalf in January, our last appearance on our behalf in the trial court. And I believe it was at that hearing that a outside lawyer coming in on behalf of, broadly speaking, the Bronx Zoo, and broadly speaking, the idea that animals should be our things to do with as we please, more or less, our property. He came in and said that he told the judge, look, judge, if you rule in favor of this group, asking for even just this one right, bodily liberty for this one elephant, if you go ahead and give them what they're asking for, judge, you're going to create this slippery slope, this turn of events where essentially, as he put it, the dairy industry in New York could go out of existence. Now, it's kind of easy for us to, I think, for folks who are knowledgeable about these issues, who know that there's lots of differences between an elephant and cows, for example, can kind of scoff and almost laugh at that and say, oh, that's absurd. But we have to take a step back, certainly we do, and be mindful of the broader culture, right? The fact that some judges are kind of sympathetic to greater or lesser extent with an argument like that. They are very fearful because this has never been done, because no animals, non-human animals, have ever had any rights in our system. And in a lot of ways, it's kind of alien to our system, or it's actually not that alien to it, but there's a certain view of our law that sees what we're trying to do as very much alien to what the law is for, which is to protect the interests of human beings. So against that backdrop, where the other side in, outside actors more and more kind of injecting themselves, particularly in the agriculture, biomedical, these different industries that obviously rely very heavily on the bodies of animals and the lives of animals and being able to use them for profit. They clearly see what we're doing as a threat. They have been writing about this for a very long time, even though we're very careful and very specific about what it is that we're doing. And that is not because we draw a moral line to say that certain species are more, morally significant because, say, for example, they, like Happy, can recognize themselves in a mirror, or, all the different traits that we talk about, autonomy, broadly speaking, the cognitive abilities of these animals. So we don't hold that up as a moral ground, but we are mindful of the fact that, we're trying to change a law that has been the way that it is for thousands of years, and that is, in a lot of ways, very much determined not to see any animals get rights. But we have to, we think, begin the process with the strongest case that we think we can make as lawyers. And that kind of comes back to autonomy. This is a value, we call it a value in the law. And what we mean by that is something that judges have talked about a lot. They've decided cases in favor of humans based on this idea of autonomy. And so our argument, in one way, in a nutshell, is to say, well, science now tells us that elephants, chimpanzees, other species are autonomous, that they have their own free will, they can recognize, that they have a past, a present, a future. These values that we really, it seems, the same things, the qualities in human beings that we seek, that we see as so important in needing these legal protections. And that's, again, not to say that they are in a category to themselves, but when 90% or more of the population is eating different animals, the idea that a judge would start by giving rights to them, I think is not how it's going to go. You have kind of incremental things, what we refer to broadly as welfare, and that's a whole separate conversation. But I do think that it's pretty clear that the focus for some animals still has to be welfare, even though that's not a satisfying answer. But for some species, at least, I think we're at the point where we can say, look, we can really draw the line and say that they can no longer be used. They can't be held captive. They can't, be used for profit, and they have to at least be recognized as having a single right. So that's a lot, but I'll turn it over to Courtney, because I'm sure I left some stuff out.
Yeah, and actually, before we turn to Courtney, just to build on what you said for a second, and thank you for all that, just to clarify what we mean when we say we work incrementally, and what we mean when we talk about incremental changes pursued through animal welfare laws. And we'll get to this more in a second, but we seek what we could consider incremental victories in our litigation, say a procedural obstacle that might prevent somebody who cares about an animal from even getting in court. And so those kind of incremental victories can help the whole movement by, just giving the animals a voice in that form. So we'll talk more about that in a bit, but I'm gonna let Courtney go now if you want to talk about our legislation.
Yeah, sure. To build upon what Kevin and Lauren just said, and maybe to go in a bit of a different direction in terms of our strategy with legislation, in addition to seeking rights for a limited group of species, the ones that have been determined to be self-aware and autonomous beings, we're going incrementally, like starting small, starting in cities to get ordinances passed, and then go larger to state, and then hopefully ultimately federal, because it makes sense to go city by city to get buy-in from local jurisdictions. So once we go before a state legislature, they don't feel like they're taking this huge step. They're sort of rubber stamping what other jurisdictions in their state have already passed. And so that's our strategy with legislation, why we're starting small, because I know we've gotten a couple of questions why we aren't trying to seek like a federal animal rights law or starting at the state level. And it just makes sense from a strategic standpoint and from past social justice movements that have been successful to start small, start locally, build a movement, and then we can get larger. And that also goes for the types of animals that we represent. Like Kevin said, we have to be strategic and start small. The animals that the science is there and backs up their autonomy. So that's our strategy.
Thank you. And actually I have a related follow-up question that came from email, I think, which is, do we plan to work in every state in the US?
For legislation, I would say yes. During my webinar, I talked about there is this home rule issue that we come against, and that's what the states have granted, the authority the states have granted to the cities to sort of oversee themselves. And some states have strong home rule authority, have given strong home rule authority to local jurisdictions, and so we're able to go city by city in those states and get ordinances passed. In other states we won't, we'll have to go straight to the state level. And so yes, we do plan on ultimately, far in the future, working in every state in some way. And it might not be legislation or litigation, it could just be an active campaign. We are leading the movement for non-human animal rights, and there are multiple components to that movement. It's legislation, litigation, grassroots advocacy, campaigns, just education, bringing awareness, and that can be done everywhere. It can be done in every state, it can be done in every country. So from the work I do, yes, we plan on working in every state.
Great. Kevin?
That's a much, I like Courtney's answer better than the one I might have, because litigation, at least with respect to our, and I know we got some other questions about this, the specifics about the type of work that we do, habeas corpus petitions. Going back a decade ago, even starting before then, the Non-Human Rights Project, with the help of really lots and lots of law student volunteers, myself included at the time, compiled information about every, what we call common law jurisdiction. So that's, England, United States, but also looking within the United States. So looking at every one of the 50 states with these metrics, about 60 different metrics, including kind of basic questions like, does this state still use the common law of habeas corpus? And for some of them, either they're like Louisiana, which is a civil code state, so they're based on French law. So it's kind of this quirk where they never really had common law to begin with. And then you have other states that may have had common law habeas corpus at one time in the past, but then over the generations, some of them have made, the legislatures in those states may have made the decision to basically turn it into a thing of statute by passing a statute that kind of regulates habeas corpus and takes the power, the common law power, away from judges in that state. But New York, Connecticut, California, Colorado, other states, quite a few states actually, still do have, to a greater or lesser extent, the kind of things that we think are valuable and important when we're trying to plan where to file a habeas corpus petition the way that we do. It may, and this is kind of skipping ahead to a question, and maybe it sort of comes up in your mind if you hear this, well, aren't there other ways to bring these kind of claims to court? And there are some that we're aware of. That's another thing that we've spent a lot of time researching, a long time ago. So there's these other kind of common law legal devices, these things that have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years that that could potentially work. But broadly speaking, litigation, I think for this issue is always going to be somewhat limited, and that's okay, because like Courtney said, it's in a really massive social movement, which this is. We can't expect that any one kind of technique or strategy or way of working is going to be enough on its own to see the kind of change that I think we all agree that we need to see. But that being said, we've seen, and I think going back to, and I hope some of, all of you have read or been able to see the decision in our New York cases back in 2018 that came from one judge of the highest court in New York, which is called the Court of Appeals. That was Judge Fahey. Some of you hopefully are familiar with that name. And, he, I think, really understood the issues here. And you can see that when he says things like, the question whether a chimpanzee has a right to liberty protected by habeas corpus, he says, relates to our relationship to all the life around us. We didn't put anything like that in our briefs, right? We are very careful to be very specific, very much every claim that we make about the cognitive abilities is tied to a scientific affidavit, and all of this research, even when it comes to, legal arguments, we're using legal arguments that have been around for hundreds of years, largely, just repurposed to work for non-human animals. And so we think that, Judge Fahey and certainly Judge Tuitt in Happy's case, and other judges who, just tell us these things privately and not publicly, they really understand that this is part of a much bigger problem. But, for us, we do have to be mindful of our words being used against us, right? If for the next time we're in court, someone to say, well, here's a webinar that, the Non-Human Rights Project did where they said that their real plan is to do X, Y, Z, open every cage at once, and while that might be appealing as, an emotional way, we all understand that that's not the way that the world is going to change, and it's not realistic to think that it will. And that can be a little sobering at first, but I think it's actually very empowering because it forces us to focus on work that can really force a tangible change, but also because it's such a, you're going to the fundamental question of, can animals have rights at all? The process of doing that in a very public way, in a very, having people like Lauren who can, package it and deliver it and explain what we're doing, to have people see that all over the world. And we've seen firsthand how that can inspire people to think about new ways to solve these problems that we just have never even thought about.
Thank you. And Kevin, you already dug into this a little bit, but someone, Katie, asked about whether we consider other legal approaches before we filed petitions for writs of habeas corpus. And I'll let you touch on that, like just sort of other possibilities there. But I guess I want to just say, because we get this question too, not that it was asked for this webinar, but what has been the case and will always be the case for us, we don't see a way around the personhood issue in the court. So a lot of times people are frustrated because judges aren't quite ready to recognize our clients as legal persons. They're getting there, as Kevin mentioned with Fahey, and we'll talk a little bit more about Tuitt's decision as well in a minute. But so they're getting there, but people wonder, do you have to pursue personhood? Like, is that just an insurmountable obstacle? But we argue that you just can't go around it. Like in the courts, at least, to have rights, you need to be recognized as a legal person. If you're not a legal person, you're a de facto legal thing. So any approach we take, we feel has to contend with that core issue, and we're the only organization taking that approach. So Kevin, did you want to, don't go too long into this, just because I guess we're already halfway through, which is amazing. But could you just briefly touch on some of the other possibilities, legally speaking, like manumission?
Sure. So there's one called manumission, which has this interesting history whereby slave owners could manumit their slaves, which is they would basically file a document saying, well, this was my property, but I no longer wish it to be so, and now you're free. That was less so the American tradition, which is why you had habeas corpus petitions filed. And also this other one called de homine replegiando, which I'm not even exactly sure what it means in Latin, but it's very much functionally equivalent to habeas corpus. We looked at it for a while and still do. I think it's even more, it's very obscure, and most people have not heard of it, but it did in some circumstances appear to offer the potential of a jury trial, which to us was very interesting. If you put this question in front of a jury of folks as opposed to just a single judge, you might presumably see and expect a different kind of result. But Lauren, is absolutely right that we do have to contend, legally speaking, with this idea of who is a person. And I think that can be easily kind of misconstrued. I think one of the best ways of understanding it comes from the philosopher's brief that was filed in our cases. And just real briefly, they start that by saying, because in our present legal system, you can only be a thing or a person, chimpanzees must be persons. If there's only these two choices, and a person has the capacity for rights and a thing does not have the capacity for rights at all, you have to go that one way. That's not an endorsement of personhood necessarily, or this whole construct. And frankly, to us, we don't really care about the personhood in and of itself. It just so happens that under our legal system, it's the only way you can have the capacity for rights. It doesn't mean that it always has to be that way. In theory, we could imagine some other way, plenty of other ways of organizing our legal system. And I think that will come to pass. And I think it's already starting, particularly in other countries. But yeah, right now it's an either or proposition. And so, we have to continue pushing for personhood, like you said.
Yeah, thanks. Just to reiterate that we always want to pursue what we think will succeed in practical terms based on the legal system we have, maybe not the legal system we might want. So thank you, Kevin, for that. So here I'm going to bundle together a couple anonymous questions and a question from Susan. This has to do with how we select our clients and the animals we seek to help. And so we have someone asking about other great apes, gorillas and bonobos. We have someone asking about if we plan to advocate for the rights of wild non-human animals. And by that, I think they mean animals who are rightly still in the wild, not who haven't been taken out of it. And then also laboratory test animals. So Kevin and Courtney, could you just speak to how we select our clients and where we see room for expansion there? Maybe Courtney, go first.
Yeah, I can take that one, and I think all the rest is perfect for Courtney. But really quickly, it comes back to this autonomy question again. So And again, you know, I think it's important to stress, because I think this is a point that even a lot of lawyers and judges don't always grasp, is that, you know, autonomy is really valuable to us because judges already claim to believe in it. So that puts us in a much more powerful position when we can go to court and say, well, science tells us this elephant is autonomous. If you believe, you as being, you know, the common law, these hundreds and thousands of judges over the years that have created this thing that we call the common law collectively, if you really believe what you're saying, then, you know, you can't continue to deny rights across the board to every single animal just because they're not human, because, you know, that is currently how the law views them. So it goes back to, you know, how we select our clients is somewhat limited from the outset by that factor. Although science is revealing more and more about species who may be autonomous. And Courtney can talk about how in the legislative context, this stuff really doesn't matter, which is kind of frankly exciting. But in the legal, you know, going to the courtroom context, we do have to go in there because it's such a different atmosphere, and every claim that you make is going to be tested and fought against. We have to really go in, we think, with a much sharper, narrower case. And so we start with looking at the states. You know, we decided that New York was a promising state for us years ago, and to start there. And then we looked at every, you know, elephant, chimpanzee, great ape, you know, bonobo, gorilla. We kind of have ran down a checklist, who's in the state. And, you know, for a number of reasons, largely because we already had the scientific evidence, because Jane Goodall was a board member, and, you know, it made sense to begin with chimpanzees. Again, you know, I talked about the sort of some of the limiting factors that we have to try to keep in mind because what we're doing is so novel and different. But, you know, that's basically why we've stuck to the species we have so far.
I'll answer the other two questions. We do plan on advocating on behalf of other great ape species in addition to, or members of the great ape family, and the taxonomy of it, I'm probably getting it wrong, but right now, currently for gorillas, we're gathering the scientific evidence supporting their autonomy and their complex cognitive and emotional capabilities. And that's sort of the process that we have to go through as we decide to take on a new species as a client. So right now we're working on getting the science and all the foundational research done for gorillas. And then we'll, you know, move on to bonobos, orangutans. And we're also, in addition to great apes, we're currently working on getting the scientific or all the research to support our work to bring a case on behalf of orcas. So we are broadening the scope, and, you know, the most important part is just gathering the research, because like Kevin said, in our court cases, proving or demonstrating their autonomy is very important. And it also is important for the legislature. The lawmakers that I've spoken to, they really value that we base our work on science rather than, you know, it is very emotional, and, you know, the emotional appeal is very important, and a lot of people feel very tied to this issue, but the science, it really does demonstrate the difference of our work, and it's another validation of why these animals deserve to have their fundamental rights recognized and protected by the legislature. And with respect to wild animals, we have been involved in some work to secure fundamental rights for wild orcas, specifically the southern resident killer whales in the Puget Sound area of Washington. An organization called the Earth Law Center is leading that campaign, and we've been involved with that. And I do foresee us, you know, working on that in the future. But by securing and protecting the fundamental rights of non-human animals that are currently held captive, especially through legislation, it will ensure that no wild animal or no wild member of that specific species can be held captive and denied their freedom within that specific jurisdiction. So by passing these rights ordinances, by being successful in our litigation, we're also protecting the rights of animals that are still wild and in their natural habitat. So by ensuring that their rights are protected here in the United States, it's preventing them from being brought here and held captive and creating future captive generations of that specific species. So,
thank you.
And one other quick thing on the wild animal stuff, because, you know, that is really not just fascinating, but I think so obviously important thinking to the future, because the goal here is not to kind of go from captive situation one to the next and continue to file lawsuits. The goal is to really, as Courtney and Lauren have said, take these wins, even incremental wins in the courtroom and elsewhere, and then kind of give them the structure to have a life of their own, so that they, become codified in laws elsewhere, or that they otherwise help keep animals out of these situations to begin with. And one exciting thing, in addition to some of the federal, interest around potentially, protecting orcas in their native environment, so like in the Pacific Northwest, is that when we make progress in the court cases, it helps us to go to, for example, the legal academy around environmental law, or what's now evolving, this idea of rights of nature. So we were invited to contribute to a textbook that's coming out. We'll be in lots of law schools very soon. And what this does, it takes, there's a whole chapter on our cases, and I think this is very useful, because historically there's been this kind of divide between environmental people and animal rights people. And it's kind of seen as, broadly speaking, this environmentalists are the science-based ones, and the animal people are the emotional ones. The environmental people can see the value of a population, say, over the interests of an individual of that species, whereas a rights person might balk at that, right? Might take an opposite tack. And so I think for a long time, these two schools of thought almost seemed hopelessly opposed to each other in different, really pretty meaningful ways. But I think things like climate change, what we're going through now with this global pandemic, is opening a lot of eyes very quickly to the common connections between the two. And I think will open up doors to, for example, I think the idea of an orca or an elephant or other keystone species, and this is not certainly a new idea, but that if you protect them in a certain ecosystem, you, by virtue of doing that, are really kind of protecting a lot of other species underneath them as well, if we're kind of thinking of this sort of food chain idea, which is, we don't want to get into that, but suffice to say that there is, I think, a lot, I'm hopeful and, excited that in the future, that will kind of become where a lot of effort starts to go. And even more exciting, I think, is that other people are taking it up. We've had, like Courtney mentioned, legislators and different folks get in touch with us at all different levels of government, because they've heard about us or seen us, or the idea, they're attracted to the idea, and then they go on and start advocating it themselves, which is, there's a lot of power in that, because we as the, advocates, we push the conversation, but, not everyone wants to hear this message from the Non-Human Rights Project, but they might want to hear it from their legislator or a judge that they've known for a long time, or somebody else in their community.
Thank you. And actually, Kevin, I wondered if you could talk briefly to this question, which is thinking about progress that has been made internationally regarding like Cecilia, the chimpanzee in Argentina, and there's some other examples, but thinking about the progress that has been made internationally in relation to the progress that we've made in the US. Like, could you talk a little bit about how those kind of work together, if that makes sense?
Sure. So I think courts outside the US are really taking the ball and running with it in a lot of ways. And that's been exciting. And it's also been exciting to see that our work has played in some cases, quite a large role in that. A lot of the habeas corpus cases that have been filed, and some of the successful ones in Latin America, have been, at least in part, based on our work, which is, we love. That's why we put everything that we file in its entirety up on our website, which is pretty unique for any kind of legal organization to do. Whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, good, bad, or ugly, we put it up on our websites so people can learn from it and copy it, and hopefully they, call us and say, ask about some of the details, or try to learn from our mistakes, if nothing else. But, in Argentina, you mentioned, in India, there have been a number of cases that have literally cited our work, including a recent one that I'm very much behind on writing about, but I promised Lauren that I will do that soon. There was a habeas corpus case brought in India recently, but it's kind of the opposite of how we do it. It was what's called a mahout, who basically someone who owns an elephant in India and often makes their living from, you know, using them for entertainment in the streets and different things. His elephant in Delhi, capital of India, was taken away by the wildlife because, you know, they were living under a bridge basically in Delhi in an urban environment, a terrible place for an elephant. So they came in and took the elephant named Lakshmi to a rehabilitation center, which, you know, under circumstances we think is the best, you know, outcome from that scenario. So this guy was obviously distraught, the mahout, and he brought a habeas corpus petition to try to recover the elephant Lakshmi. He argued that it was causing her mental anguish to be away from him. He made all these arguments, but interestingly, he cited us. He said, look what these lawyers, you know, in the United States, they got a hearing for this elephant Happy. He tried to, as you know, legal minds might do, take that and twist it around to do the opposite thing. But fortunately, and this is why we're writing about it, the judge in that case rejected it. He said, he didn't come out and say, you know, habeas can never be, you know, appropriate for an elephant, but it was pretty clear, like, you can't use it as a claim of ownership. You can't certainly use it to take an elephant from a better place to a clearly worse place that is not suited to how an elephant is, you know, like a reserve kind of sanctuary versus an urban environment. You know, it's pretty obvious which one's better for an elephant. So, you know, and that's a case that is, you know, only a month or two behind the work that we're doing. It's being cited in, you know, courts all around the world. So that in itself is exciting, but even more so, I think, is the fact that these courts in other countries, Colombia is another example, they're starting to apply these ideas in the environmental context too, which I find very exciting, and the positive direction. So some of you may have heard, and this has happened in India and in New Zealand and other places too, we've started to see rivers and mountains and national parks and different parts of the environment declared to be legal persons. So this idea of personhood is not at all restricted to the work that we're doing, which is another, I think, really interesting common ground that we have with environmental rights of nature groups. And, you know, they're really putting it to work in, I think, you know, a way that is important, not just for animals, but, you know, protecting the places where they live so that they don't face those kinds of threats, in addition to being, you know, stolen and held captive or sold the way that they are now.
Thanks. There's so much more we could say about that, and maybe we'll devote a future webinar to all that. But we have about 15 minutes left. So I wanted to ask Courtney a question. Actually, it's two questions that I'm squeezing together, which are the question of if Happy or Minnie are being mistreated, can't you have the government seize them? I'm not sure if they mean the local or state or federal government, but that. And then a somewhat related question, I think, has to do with the arguments that zoos make about why they should be able to imprison elephants, the conservation work that they cite. And we had a question from Madeline and Catherine about whether, like, how do we push back on the arguments the zoos make about imprisoning animals like Happy? And then are we noticing a change in attitudes among zoos regarding animal rights? So I just gave you a lot there.
I know, I think that's more than two questions, but
yeah, actually it is.
I'll start with the first one, which was, and tell me if I got this wrong, why we can't have the government, whether it be a state, local, or some sort of agency, go and seize Minnie or Happy because they're being mistreated or seemingly mistreated. So one, we never, like, we don't argue that they're being mistreated in our work. We argue that they have the right to liberty and should be free to a sanctuary. But in the case, let's take Minnie, for example. After Minnie is our elephant client in Goshen, Connecticut, who's currently being held captive and exploited by the Comerford Zoo. And when we initially filed our case on behalf of Minnie, there were 2 other elephants being held captive with her, Beulah and Karen. Last year, we learned that both Beulah and Karen had died. Karen died in March of 2019 of kidney disease, and Beulah died in public at the Big E Fair in Massachusetts, and she was 54 years old. And because of their very public nature of Beulah's death, and there had been previous concerns about the treatment of Minnie and the other, Minnie, Beulah, and Karen, and after the death of Beulah, there were a state agency, the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, did do an investigation, and the USDA also did an investigation, and they found that the Comerford Zoo was not violating animal welfare laws, and therefore they did not have the authority to seize Minnie. And that just goes to show why welfare laws are not enough. While welfare laws might require that the animals have, food and shelter, and some states have prohibited the use of tools like, they're not even tools, like torture devices like a bull hook. It still doesn't, they're still suffering, they're still being held captive. And so even though it appears that these animals are suffering and they're being mistreated, the fact is the animal welfare laws are so minimal that it's really easy to meet the standards set by state welfare laws in the Federal Animal Welfare Act. So there's nothing we can really do to force the seizure of the specific client. That's not to say if you see something, obviously file a complaint with the relevant agency, but that's why we need to have their rights recognized, because these welfare laws, while they reduce their suffering, the animal, Minnie, whoever, is still suffering because they're held captive. And the only way to prevent the suffering is to ensure their rights. And that's why we filed cases, and we're seeking to have their rights recognized by the legislatures. So there's that. And also, a lot of people say, why doesn't the USDA go in and do something? The USDA really, they just are more like a licensing agency. Like, they'll just go and make sure that whatever entity, whether they have like an exhibitor license or a breeder's license, that they're just meeting the requirements set forth by that license. It's, the welfare laws are so minimal, and they're also really difficult to enforce. So yeah.
Thank you.
Could you remind me of the second question?
Yes, of course. The second question, where was it? It had to do with wondering how to, what's our response to the arguments that zoos make about how,
oh yeah, the conservation efforts.
Yeah, that they justify imprisoning an elephant according to, conservation.
I'll talk specifically about elephants, and I think, I'm not going to say this can apply to all animals because I don't think this is true, but because I'll get into it. Okay, so with respect to elephants, zoos will often say that they're helping conserve the species by doing captive breeding programs, or had, like, let's take Happy for example. Happy's a wild-born Asian elephant. She wasn't captive born in a zoo. She was brought in from her home country into the United States to be exploited. Nothing about keeping Happy in prison is helping save wild elephants. Asian elephants are endangered. Nothing about keeping Happy in prison is helping wild elephants. Zoos that have captive breeding programs, they're not sending the offspring that are produced in those zoos back into the wild to repopulate the wild population. They're keeping them captive and creating a future generation of captive elephants. The same goes for gorillas, for chimpanzees, for all the great apes. The zoos are not helping, the imprisonment of elephants or chimpanzees or gorillas is in no way helping the wild, threatened, and endangered populations. And there are plenty of researchers that are out in the field, in the wild, observing wild elephants and wild chimpanzees and wild gorillas and wild orcas, and learning a lot about them, and coming up with ways to help the species. So in some zoos, like let's take the Bronx Zoo, which is owned and operated by the Wildlife Conservation Society, which they do good research, and they do have legitimate scientists that are out in the field, and their field work is what is helping the species and helping other scientists and other conservationists learn about what can be done to help elephants. Nothing about keeping Happy imprisoned or Patty, who's there with her, and they're both kept alone in a tiny, they only have a 1 acre yard. They're in this, if you watch the Animal Planet series, The Zoo, where they showed Happy, you see the inside of their barn. It's a concrete windowless barn with lined cages, and the cages have like bars, like it looks like a prison. Nothing about that is helping conserve the species. Now, that's not to say that zoos don't do some good things. Here at the LA Zoo, they've done some for native wildlife that have been threatened or endangered, some breeding programs, but that's with native species where they help repopulate that species and then release them back into the wild. There are also some zoos like the Detroit Zoo that has made the decision to close their elephant exhibit and send them to sanctuary, no longer imprison species like elephants, but they face a lot of problems because the AZA, which is the accrediting body of zoos, the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, they put a lot of restrictions on zoos and sort of hold their accreditation over their head, saying, well, if you send the elephants to a sanctuary, you're going to lose your accreditation. So while there may be some zoo directors and some zoo employees who do want to do the right thing and no longer imprison, chimpanzees or elephants, they also come up across a really big dilemma: is do we risk losing our AZA accreditation? And the concern with that is if they don't have the AZA accreditation, they could be seen as maybe a roadside zoo. So there's just a lot of unnecessary politics with it as well.
And could I ask you a follow-up question? It just comes from me, which is, does that imply then that the AZA needs to take a forceful stance on that? Like they're a roadblock there. So the question that someone asked about, if we foresee a change in attitudes among zoos, like would it help to view the AZA as like who you have to target there to get to the next?
Yeah, I definitely think the AZA needs to change their stance. I know they have made very slow but positive changes, like
Very slow.
they now said that elephants should not be kept alone. They should be kept, I think the minimum is 3 elephants per exhibit. They've increased, they're saying that elephants need to have a certain amount of space. They said they can know what they're phasing out the use of the bullhook. Good, that's, good progress, but they're still imprisoning elephants, and so they're going to continue to suffer. And so, yeah, I think the AZA, they need to be petitioned to stop, end elephant exhibits, stop imprisoning elephants. The first thing they can do is stop captive breeding programs, and then transition to a sanctuary type model where they no longer imprison, they put the interests of the animals first rather than human interests above those of the animals. So yeah, I think, in order for there to successfully be change amongst AZA zoos, the AZA needs to change their policies and recognize that certain animals just should not be held captive.
Right. Thank you. Okay. Well, it's 11:57, and I wish we had a whole nother hour to go over questions because there's so much more here. So I wonder if we should do a part 2 of this sometime soon. Is everyone cool with that? Part 2. For example, we have a lot of questions about working in animal rights or volunteering in animal rights, broadly speaking, or with the NhRP. There were questions having to do with what are our achievements in the US and just trying to make sense of the various court decisions. We also have a lot of questions about what kind of collaborations we do currently and we want to do, and then our international work, which is highly collaborative. And so I guess I just want to say we appreciate all those questions, and we want to get to them in another seminar and give them the attention that they're due. What's that?
Lauren, I'll just interrupt you just really quickly. If you are interested in volunteering, because I know now we do have a lot of, more time on our hands, and, we're really working, I think Kevin and I both talked about during our webinars, we're going to be putting out an educational module so that you can sort of learn how to become fluent in animal rights talk and learn how to advocate for non-human animal rights, and also be a volunteer at the NhRP. But if you have any interest in volunteering, please feel free to email us either at the info or volunteer@nonhumanrights.org. And one of us will be in touch shortly, because we're going to have some projects for you all to work on.
Yes, thank you. And I wanted to say too that we recognize that this could be more interactive, and that, like, we love to see all your faces, and we are exploring ways to bring people into the conversation live. It was a bit traumatizing if you were there for the first webinar. We got Zoom bombed. It was horrible. And so we're just trying to preempt those kind of issues and being extra cautious. But we are looking at maybe the idea of having smaller groups to just, control who's in the room and that sort of thing. So we see you, and we want to bring you into the conversation. We're working on that. And then also a reminder that we record these. You can watch them later. They're on our YouTube page, and that we have more seminars planned, including some interviews with people in the NhRP orbit. Those will happen in May. And as always, if you have any questions, you can email us at info@nonhumanrights.org, and we'll either email you back personally, or we will address them in a future seminar, or both. So yeah, Courtney and Kevin, is there anything you want to say before we say goodbye to everybody?
Just thank you so much for joining us. These webinars have been really fun, and I hope we've answered your questions, and you've learned more about the work we're doing, and maybe feel a bit more connected to us, getting to sort of meet us. And yeah, like Lauren said, feel free. I'm happy to answer any questions. I have a little more time, so I can even call you. But thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to having more webinars next month, focusing on interviews. So turn it over to Kevin.
Yeah, just thank you everybody for your support, your attention, your interest, your passion for the issues, and we look forward to seeing you again, and stay safe.
Yeah. Okay, Mickey, who's our voice.
Hello, our hidden voice. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Like everyone's saying, thank you so much for joining us. I'll be sending around an email with the recording, so please feel free to watch again or share on your various social media channels, and we'll have more updates on more of these soon. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.